Admiral Takeo Kurita, faithful to the ancient arts of his ancestors, sometimes practiced archery on the foredeck of his flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago. His sailors would watch as the commander of the Second Fleet, straight-backed and silent, fired arrows into a target. Kurita had spent his more than 3 decades at sea perfecting the art of firing torpedoes, modern arrows, that could sink warships from a range of up to 11 miles. He was regarded as one of the Imperial Navy's leading experts in night torpedo attacks. And yet, despite seeing considerable action since the war began, he had never had the chance to fire a torpedo against an American ship. Mostly, his war had consisted of being bombed by American warplanes at Midway, Santa Cruz, Rabaul, the Marianas. Perhaps in the Philippines his luck would change and he would destroy the enemy in a surprise torpedo attack at night. That was his official position, at least. Privately, he was full of doubts. On the evening of October 15th, as the sun set over the flat, sandy islands of the Linga anchorage, Admiral Kurita appeared on the foredeck of the Atago, alone and looking lost in thought. From the bridge, Quartermaster Kosaku Koitabashi watched as the Admiral sat down in a folding chair that had been placed in front of a gun turret. Drafted as a young man at 20, now a battle-tested sea dog at 24, Quartermaster Koitabashi had spent many hours standing by the Admiral on the bridge, and he knew his commander's moods. Koitabashi turned to a signalman, Nagaoka, and asked, "Why is the Admiral so tense?" The 2 petty officers watched as Admiral Kurita slowly and deliberately looked around the anchorage at the 39 Imperial Japanese Navy warships swinging at their moorings in the last rays of daylight. The firepower of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been concentrated in this one calm, tepid bay at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, 1,000 miles from the homeland, but close to the so-called Southern Resources area, the oil-rich islands of the East Indies that provided their fuel. The colossal Yamato and Musashi loomed at anchor. Almost 3 years into the war, they had never seen action against an enemy ship. Their 18-inch guns, the largest naval guns ever forged, had never been fired in ship-to-ship combat. The sacred behemoths had been saved, preserved, protected for the final decisive battle. Around them, grey and leaden in the shimmering turquoise waters, were 5 more massive battleships, 11 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 19 destroyers. It was an armada for the ages, though with one glaring weakness: there were no aircraft carriers anywhere to be seen. Japan's few remaining flat-tops were still in the inland sea of the home islands, awaiting planes and pilots with at least enough training to take off, if not land. As Kurita sat quietly on Atago's foredeck, he seemed to be looking from ship to ship, as if to take their measure. Suddenly, Kurita's chief of staff, Admiral Koyanagi, appeared at his elbow and whispered into his ear. Watching from the bridge, Quartermaster Koitabashi and signalman Nagaoka looked at each other knowingly. The long-awaited day of decisive battle, they felt sure, was at hand. The 2 sailors, both non-commissioned officers, fancied that they were in on all the scuttlebutt. Every day, after breakfast or lunch or dinner, a gaggle of NCOs would gather by the tobacco bon, a large metal ashtray set on the fantail behind the toilets, to smoke and gossip. Koitabashi and Nagaoka were in the 7th Division, the bridge detail of quartermasters who keep the charts and the logs, signalmen and lookouts, and they were particularly welcome at the bon. Signalmen could show off by leaking the contents of decoded cables to their fellow petty officers, a forbidden practice, but routine nonetheless. "We were the first to know what the bridge was up to," recalled Koitabashi. Like every sailor in the fleet, they had been told they were training for decisive battle, but not where or when. Then, in early October, coded telegrams had begun arriving from combined fleet headquarters in Tokyo. "We knew from leaks that this battle would decide the fate of Japan," Koitabashi recalled. "We knew this would be the last sea battle." Koitabashi and his mates would gossip about their superior officers. "I never heard a negative word about Admiral Kurita," Koitabashi recalled. "He was an expert in torpedoes. I thought he was a great man. His opinion was more mixed about Admiral Ugaki. Men loved or hated him," recalled Koitabashi. "He was seen as arrogant." On the right wing of the main bridge of his flagship, Admiral Kurita sat in a large swivel chair, which the sailors called Saru no Koshikake, the flat mushroom, the place where the top monkey sat in the jungle. Behind him stood the operations officer, Captain Otani. Garrulous, confident, Otani was a commanding figure, though a bit officious. He did most of the talking, consulting with Admiral Koyanagi, the low-key, quietly bitter but gentlemanly chief of staff, who would in turn seek Kurita's final judgment. The admiral of the fleet barely spoke. He would swivel in his chair and nod and smile slightly. On the eve of battle, the petty officers cadging their post-prandial smokes on the fantail were fairly upbeat, eager for action. Non-commissioned officers like Koitabashi were the heart of the Japanese Navy, spirited, diligent, faithful to orders, and well-trained. The best in the world, according to British naval historian Arthur Marder. True, they could hardly avoid seeing that the war was not going well. Even if the Japanese press lied about the illusory victories, the sailors could see that the combined fleet was gradually retreating, or in the approved lexicon, changing course, westward, closer to home. Koitabashi had seen the human cost, badly wounded sailors from sunk or burning ships, laid out on makeshift operating tables in the Atago's wardroom. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, it had been disheartening to watch the young pilots veering and crashing as they tried to land their planes on the decks of carriers. And what had become of those carriers? When would they rejoin the fleet? Even so, Koitabashi and his mates could see with their own eyes that the epicenter of Japan's naval might, the literal and figurative soul of the Navy, was still intact. Since schoolboy days, Koitabashi had believed that the key to national greatness, celebrated in poem and song in the classroom and on the radio, was the battleship. Majestic castles of steel, the Yamato and Musashi strained at their anchor chains just a few hundred yards from Koitabashi's post on the bridge of the Atago. At night, in practice, the great guns of the super battleships flowered with orange blossoms, flinging massive shells for miles in the dark. Surely Koitabashi and his fellow smokers reassured themselves the American fleet could not withstand such power. The men did notice, however, that their superior officers seemed worried, even downcast. Their normally amiable commander, Admiral Kurita, was notably somber. The admiral, still suffering from the lingering effects of dengue fever, had shrunk into his leathery skin. Kurita was always wizened and weathered, but now he looked exhausted and careworn. Kurita had much to worry about. He did not believe the reports from Tokyo of a smashing victory over the American fleet off Formosa, the claims that 12 or more carriers had been sunk. As was his customary practice, Kurita divided all claims by Japanese pilots in half, but even that, he could guess, was a generous estimate. Kurita was on his own, isolated and cut out of the Shogo planning. He was facing a decisive battle, possibly one that really would be decisive. Japan could no longer trade space for time as it backed across the Pacific. Kurita was well aware that the Philippines had to be defended, or the empire would be cut off from its fuel source in the southern resources area. But the commander of the Second Fleet, or as his fleet had now been named, the First Diversionary Striking Force, had heard very little from headquarters, save orders to prepare for a coming battle. His fleet's new name was loaded with irony. It clearly suggested that Kurita's battleships would act as a decoy or diversion, while Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet of aircraft carriers delivered the main attack. But without planes, Ozawa's carriers were powerless. They could only play the part of decoy. Kurita's force would not be diversionary. His battleships and cruisers would be the main event, the Navy's hope to repel the American invaders in the Philippines. In some of the early show planning, the admirals in Tokyo had discussed sending 2 or 3 carriers down to escort Kurita's battleships and provide air cover. Kurita had never been directly or formally informed of this planning. He had to rely on rumor and speculation. In August, Combined Fleet Headquarters had condescended to Kurita by sending a mere captain to brief Kurita's fleet on the show plan. Kurita was being told, in effect, "Do your duty. We do not need your advice." It was understood or expected that Kurita would accept his fate and his obligation. Some Japanese naval historians cast the appointment of Kurita in a cynical light. He was, after all, a rather lackluster choice to lead the fleet into decisive battle. It may be that Kurita was being set up as a fall guy, a kind of grand strategic patsy. For all the brave rhetoric, the less deluded of the top command could have guessed that the show plan was doomed to fail. They may have figured that Kurita would go down without protesting, or that in any case he would be easy to blame. Kurita may or may not have suspected that he was being badly used. He never complained, but he was a realist. He understood that he would be steaming into battle with only spotty air cover, if any at all. The Philippines had dozens of airfields that might be used to support Kurita's fleet, but Kurita knew from battle reports that the Navy's land-based air fleets had been decimated, fed to the slaughter by Admiral Toyoda at Formosa. The army still had several hundred planes in the Philippines, but Kurita, like most naval officers, never counted on the army for help. Army pilots had not been trained to navigate over water. Besides, the army and navy, by tradition, barely communicated. Kurita had little faith in his own service's planning for battle. Interrogated by the Americans after the war, Kurita would say that Imperial Navy headquarters lacked a sureness of touch, but he was being diplomatic. He understood before he sortied from Linga Gulf that his fleet was being sent out as a kind of offering to appease the war gods and show the Japanese people that the Navy, too, would sacrifice to protect the homeland. He wondered whether his objective under the show plan was worth the cost. Was sinking some American troop transports really worth risking the Yamato and the Musashi and their crews? His hope, his devout wish he would later say, was to encounter the main American carrier fleet and sink them in a proper sea battle. Conceivably, the elaborate diversion plan would work, and the American carrier fleet would be fooled and take the bait, but Kurita was not counting on it. He assumed that he would encounter American warships along the way. He had trained all his life to fight enemy warships in a surface battle, and hoped this would be his chance. But Kurita could not control his fate. He had to accept it. On October 16th, the day he was seen sitting on the foredeck, staring across the anchorage, seemingly lost in thought, he was preparing for battle. He had cancelled orders to dry dock 2 cruisers and began making plans to sortie. Fuel was a gnawing concern. Though the fleet was close to its fuel source in the East Indies, the Navy lacked enough tankers to transport the oil. American air raids and submarines were taking their toll on the Imperial Navy's supply chain. Kurita had to figure out a way to make sure his ships had enough fuel to sail to the Philippines. Kurita's superiors in Tokyo may not have worried whether Kurita's fleet would be able to sail home from battle. But Kurita did. He was prepared to lose half his fleet, but not all of it. At 8:55 on the morning of October 17th, the order came from Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo. Stand by to execute Victory Operation No. 1. An advance force of U.S. Army Rangers was landing on Suluan Island at the mouth of Leyte Gulf. The American invasion of the Philippines was clearly imminent. Kurita gave the order to strip the fleet for action. Anything flammable or movable had to go: furniture, decorations, clothes. Sailors were to go into battle with only the shirts on their back. At 1 o'clock in the morning on October 18th, the first diversionary striking force hoisted anchor and filed from the warm, protective bay at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. The night was fair, and the great ships, with their distinctive pagoda superstructures, formed shadowy silhouettes in the gloom. One by one they went into the open sea, the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy would ever be able to muster such a force for battle. We sailed quietly east in the dark of night, recorded Admiral Ugaki, who was at his post on the bridge, high in the towering superstructure of the Yamato. The next day, as the fleet steamed northeast along the coast of Borneo, Ugaki recorded that a young hawk had perched atop the grey metal gun director of the Yamato main batteries. Some sailors had captured the hawk and caged it as a mascot. To Ugaki, this was an omen. He was looking for signs in the sky and in the beauty of nature. Later, he wrote, a faintly illuminated layer of auspicious air hung near the surface of the sea. Ugaki had drifted into the realm of the mystical, as he often did, to escape his conflicting impressions of reality. He had faithfully recorded Tokyo's claims of carriers sunk off Formosa, and then written that he didn't really believe them. He doubted that the fleet could get to the landing beaches in time to do real damage to the American invaders, yet he was somehow confident of victory. We are not afraid of 1,000,000 enemies or 1,000 carriers because our whole force shares the same spirit, Ugaki wrote in elegant ancient Japanese characters, illuminated by the red light of the battle lamp above his desk. The mood below decks in the ships of the first striking force was, like Ugaki's, at once giddy and fatalistic. "We knew we would lose our lives," recalled Hiroshi Yasunaga, a pilot of a float plane used for scouting aboard the cruiser Chikuma. Rejected by Etajima at age 17, Yasunaga had gone to flight school and bounced around the Pacific War as a reconnaissance pilot, logging more than 3,000 hours in the air. "We were ready to die, to scatter like jade," he recalled, invoking the shattered gem imagery used by the propagandists for national sacrifice and self-immolation. "I didn't think we were going to win the battle, but I was a survivor. I would survive somehow." Word of the Hawk settling on the conning tower of the Yamato spread quickly through the fleet. "A sign from the gods," proclaimed senior officers to their men. "We laughed at it," recalled Yasunaga. He and his mates aboard the Chikuma were a little cynical about their commanders. Why did Admiral Kurita choose the cruiser Atago as his flagship instead of the mighty Yamato? "Because the Yamato was easier for enemy planes to spot," joked Yasunaga and his buddies. Aboard the Atago, Petty Officer Koitabashi had heard all the jokes but defended his commander. It was traditional, he knew, for the fleet commander to fly his flag from a cruiser, which was faster and more maneuverable than a battleship, and would lead any night torpedo attacks, the opening blow in battle and Kurita's specialty. Still, Koitabashi took the talk of omens with a grain of salt. "We heard all kinds of stories, that the Hawk had landed on the thumb of the captain of the Yamato. We just laughed," recalled Koitabashi. The great fleet steamed into Brunei Bay on the coast of Borneo, a day's sail from the Philippines, at noon on October 20th. Aboard the Atago, Kurita received news that the invasion of the Philippines had begun in Leyte Gulf, just as predicted. Thousands of American troops were streaming ashore. Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo had wanted Kurita's force to barge into the American anchorage on October 22nd to catch the invaders while they were still at their most vulnerable. But it was impossible, Kurita protested in a cable to Combined Fleet Headquarters. Kurita was never one to rush into anything, including battle, as he had shown with his zigzagging and stalling on the last night of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Kurita had reason to slow his pace toward the Philippines. When he arrived at Brunei Bay for refueling, there were no tankers awaiting them. The battleships fueled the destroyers from their own tanks and waited for the Empire's supply chain, always its weakest link, to provide the necessary oil to sally forth, and, Kurita hoped, return with at least half their strength intact. As his fleet idled in a bay surrounded by mountains rising 12,000 feet out of the jungle, Kurita received some more bad news. He was to send all but 4 of his 32 float planes to the Philippines. The float planes, seaplanes stored on the stern or amidships of his cruisers and battleships, were the fleet's eyes over the horizon, used to spot enemy ships and particularly submarines. Apparently, Southwest Fleet Headquarters in Manila needed the planes for its own reconnaissance purposes. There was considerable bitterness among Kurita's officers as the float planes went winging off on the afternoon of October 20th. "I'd hate to be responsible for this decision when enemy submarines attack," remarked a staff officer, who could guess at what lay ahead for Kurita's fleet as they drew near the Philippines. While the Japanese bickered and dithered, the American invasion ground ahead. General MacArthur himself had waded ashore at Leyte Gulf, as triumphant as Caesar across the Rubicon. "People of the Philippines," the former field marshal announced into the microphones arrayed for him on Red Beach on A-Day. Eisenhower had already appropriated D-Day for the Normandy landings. "I have returned. Rally to me." With his father's derringer in his pocket in case he was captured alive, MacArthur staged his return with a showman's brio. He was supposed to arrive high and dry at a jetty, but the landing craft delivering him ran aground 100 yards shy of the beach, forcing the general and his staff to slosh in water above their knees. A cameraman caught MacArthur angrily grimacing. He was angry at a Navy aide, not the Japanese, but the picture looked so heroic that he waded ashore again the next day for the cameras. Within 24 hours of the October 20th landings, American forces pushed inland past the first line of Japanese defences. By October 22nd, nearly all the troops would be ashore. The only targets left at the beachhead for the Japanese attacking from the sea would be cargo and ammunition ships, and mostly empty troop transports. Sinking them could cause some temporary havoc, but it would hardly delay the advance of an American armada toward Japan. MacArthur's invasion force of 700 ships had stretched over 100 miles. Sink even 100 of those ships and American shipyards would just crank out 200 more. Indeed, it is hard to see how any blow struck by the Imperial Japanese Navy could strategically slow the Americans. At this stage, the Japanese were fighting for honor. On the morning of October 21st, as his battle fleet continued to idle in Brunei Bay, Kurita received his final orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo. He was to break through into Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th after first destroying the enemy's surface forces and cut down his landing forces. The 1st Diversionary Striking Force had trained to fight at night, a time when American planes usually did not mount attacks. The idea of a daylight action appalled most of Kurita's officers and Kurita too, though he tried not to show it. The final orders from Tokyo gave Kurita little realistic hope of air cover. None of Ozawa's carriers would be coming south to join forces with Kurita's battleships. They would all be staying in the north to act as a lure to draw away Halsey's carriers. The true nature of their orders began to sink in with Kurita's staff and his senior commanders. They were on a suicide mission. A few may have welcomed it. Ugaki, as usual, greeted the prospect of doom philosophically. "Well," he wrote, "if you dare to act, the devil may avoid you." Just maybe the fleet would surprise the Americans and escape, Ugaki reasoned. If not, then the 1st Diversionary Striking Force would perish memorably. Ugaki was moved by the spirit of some of his more zealous fellow admirals. The Navy's 1st Air Force, based in the Philippines, had fewer than 100 planes left to support the show operation. But Ugaki recorded in his diary that Admiral Onishi was going to organize a kamikaze special attack corps with 26 fighters, of which 13 are suicidal ones, to attack the enemy carriers. "Oh, what a noble spirit this is," exulted Ugaki. Onishi was the brilliant, volatile air expert who had once slapped a geisha and dispatched Japanese POWs to their deaths, each for the same crime, insufficient attention to duty. His frequent discussions about Toko body-slamming tactics with Captain Joe, the Emperor's military advisor, were finally nearing the execution stage. Onishi had been thinking about putting together a suicide squadron since the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which had cost so many pilots and planes back in June. Now the time had come. The shortage of planes and the desperation of the moment in the Philippines moved Onishi to introduce kamikazes to the Pacific War, just when Japan's defeat was about to be sealed. The reasoning was essentially circular nihilism. As Admiral Toyoda, the Combined Fleet's commander-in-chief, explained to American interrogators after the war, Onishi reckoned that if Admiral Kurita's fleet was taking such desperate measures, then he too, as the champion of the Air Force, must take similarly desperate measures. Kurita did not put much hope, if any, in the kamikazes. He made no mention of them during his post-war interrogation. With hundreds of miles of open ocean to cross, then a narrow strait to navigate, he would have to forge ahead, with or without air cover. His ships bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Perhaps they could raise a curtain of fire, though chances were practically nil it could keep out hundreds of determined American pilots. Kurita had been under sustained air attack before, at Rabaul when he had stood silent on the bridge as his captain, nearly disemboweled by shrapnel, was carried below, shouting banzai, as his intestines fell out. On the afternoon of October 21st, he briefed his captains on his plan of attack. The main force would leave the next morning, October 22nd, at 8 a.m. They would proceed west of Palawan Island toward the Philippines at 16 knots. This slow speed would conserve fuel, allowing, Kurita hoped, for a return voyage. At the same time, however, the plodding pace would make the fleet more vulnerable to American submarines, which ran on the surface at about 20 knots. After reaching the Philippine island of Mindoro on the morning of October 24th, the fleet would pick up steam and snake eastward through the islands of the Sibuyan Sea at 24 knots. At about sunset, the fleet would enter the San Bernardino Strait, a narrow tide-ripped passage that connected the island-filled Sibuyan Sea on the west side of the island of Leyte to the open Philippine Sea on the east. Emerging from the San Bernardino Strait, Kurita expected to encounter enemy ships, defeat them in a night action, and sail down the east coast of the island of Samar to arrive at the mouth of Leyte Gulf by dawn. The orders were a little vague about the enemy ships Kurita might encounter and defeat by night. Halsey was out there somewhere, and so were dozens of American submarines. Presumably, they would lie in wait to ambush Kurita as his ships debouched from the San Bernardino Strait on the evening of October 24th. In any case, after Kurita stormed into Leyte Gulf, it was a certainty that American warships and planes would try to trap Kurita's fleet inside the Gulf. That battle would have to be fought in broad daylight. Kurita's battle plan picked up a new wrinkle before he sortied. The striking force detached two older, slower battleships, the Yamashiro and Fuso, as well as a cruiser and 4 destroyers, to approach Leyte Gulf through Surigao Strait to the south. The two fleets, Kurita's main body of 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and the second, smaller group under Admiral Shoji Nishimura, would create a pincer movement, joining after dawn on October 25th, to bash into the American invasion fleet's anchorage. The idea behind splitting the fleet was to further confuse the Americans, to add an additional decoy that would draw off the more numerous American defenders and allow Kurita's battleships to slip by. The concept of a 2-pronged attack was not Kurita's. It had been suggested by headquarters, which seemed to delight in devising ever more intricate plans, regardless of faulty communications and the inevitable fog and friction of war. On the eve of the legendary naval battle at Trafalgar in October 1805, Admiral Lord Nelson announced his battle plan to his adoring captains. As Nelson wrote his lover Lady Hamilton, some shed tears, all approved. It was new, it was singular, it was simple. On the eve of the last and largest naval battle in history, Kurita's captains reacted less enthusiastically. Kurita was bombarded with complaints. Kurita's own operations officer, Captain Otani, worried that the overall show plan, with Ozawa manoeuvring in the north and Kurita dividing his fleet in the south and each element dependent on the other for close timing, was too complex and too inflexible to work. In his cabin aboard the Atago, Kurita sweated in the tropical heat as he read through the notes piled on his desk. His captains were in open revolt. They assured him that they did not mind death. It was the honour of the Navy they feared for. If this was to be the last great sortie of the fleet, the last gasp of the Imperial Navy, how could they justify its sacrificial altar, shooting up a fleet of empty cargo ships? Surely their ancestors must be weeping in their graves. What would the great Togo, hero of Tsushima, think of sacrificing battleships for such paltry targets? At sunset on October 21st, Kurita summoned his captains for a final banquet. From ships all around the fleet, motor launches emerged with stern men in dress whites, sitting silent and erect, their minds on the coming battle. The small boats clustered around the Atago, not a capital ship in the class of the Yamato or Musashi, but a formidable warship nonetheless. With her peculiarly Japanese features, a raked-forward smokestack, towering pagoda superstructure, long-lance torpedo tubes, and not 2 but 3 gun turrets on the foredeck, Atago was more powerful than any American cruiser of its type. Officially, Atago was a 10,000-ton ship, but the Japanese had cheated on the arms limitation treaties of the 1920s and built her at 13,000 tons, about 1/5 the weight of the Yamato. The officers gathered in Atago's wardroom, now stripped of furnishings for the modest banquet. Food stores were low. Only the emperor's portrait remained on the bulkhead walls. Under Hirohito's imposing stare, the senior officers of the first diversionary striking fleet raised their sake cups to the victory none of them thought possible. It was Kurita's time to speak. Never one for orations, he knew he had to say something to comfort and inspire his restless and anxious commanders. "I know that many of you are strongly opposed to this assignment," he began honestly. "But," he went on with equal forthrightness, "the war situation is much worse than you imagine." Several of his listeners noticed that Kurita's tone of voice was different. Normally he was benign or taciturn or just silent. Now he seemed both stern and passionate. He advanced the official line, the nihilistic reasoning of Admiral Toyoda in Tokyo. Would it not be a shame to have the fleet intact while our nation perishes? Kurita made a somewhat ambiguous nod to his superiors. "I believe that Imperial General Headquarters is giving us a glorious opportunity," he said. "In Japan, there is an important distinction between what one says in public talk and what is left unsaid, usually what one really means private thoughts. In the sudden tropical night of October in Brunei Bay, Kurita's officers understood what he really meant. According to another, less literal translation, what Kurita said, or perhaps what he really meant, was, "I think the headquarter wants to give us a place to die. We are pressured into it. Glorious chance or death sentence, it was their duty." "You must all remember there are such things as miracles," said Kurita, who did not believe in miracles. "What man can say there is no chance for our fleet to turn the tide of war in a decisive battle?" Kurita was mouthing all the platitudes. He went on, "We shall have the chance to meet our enemies. We shall engage his task forces. I hope that you will not carry your responsibilities lightly. I know that you will act faithfully and well." Some heard, between the lines and in the subtlety of his language, a more ambiguous message. "Be cautious, and fight" is another translation of the words Kurita used that night, not quite the ringing "damn the torpedoes" rallying cry that captains of the first striking fleet might have heard from a more gung-ho commander, Admiral Ozawa or Admiral Ugaki, or, for that matter, Admiral Halsey. The captains stood and cried, "Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!" Their true feelings may have been less fervent. That night, the petty officers of the fleet had their celebration in their mess hall. Koitabashi recalled the dreary scene. "On the last evening before departure, there was an order to provide us with a little sake. All the personal belongings were removed, and there were tables with stains and long benches. Even these were going to be removed from the ship. It was kind of a bare and sad room where petty officers were drinking cold sake in teacups. One was carrying a kettle of cold sake and pouring it into the teacups of young ones. 'You may die tomorrow. Drink up while you can.' At 8 a.m., the first elements of the first diversionary striking force sailed from Brunei Bay. Kurita was in the lead in Atago. He did not wish to be aboard her. The jokesters below decks and in the officers' mess who mocked him for staying away from the bigger and more prominent target, Yamato, had it wrong. Before the coming battle, Kurita had wanted to transfer with his flag and staff to a super battleship, either Yamato or Musashi, both of which had better communications gear than the Atago. But tradition, as always, ruled. Kurita was reminded by headquarters that the proper flagship for a striking fleet was a cruiser, to lead night torpedo attacks. Never mind that the battle plan, as now conceived, did not specifically call for such an action. At the tip of Borneo, the great fleet divided. Admiral Nishimura, the southern arm of the Shogo pincer, turned east with his detachment of 2 battleships, a cruiser and 4 destroyers, and made for Surigao Strait, the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf. Kurita and the main body continued north on its slow and winding journey to the San Bernardino Strait. Kurita's course on the first day took him just west of Palawan, a long thin island where Japan kept and abused, starved, and eventually incinerated American prisoners of war. The commander of the first striking force had to be careful not to stray into waters called the Dangerous Ground because of their shoals and reefs. I Have Palawan Passage, as it was called, was only about 20 to 30 miles wide, perfect for a submarine ambush. That night, 2 American submarines were waiting. The Data and the Dace were sitting quietly on the calm surface of the Palawan Passage in the cloudy, moonless dark. Their commanders had been given no specific intelligence about Kurita's fleet movements, but they knew about the invasion of Leyte Gulf, and the submarine captains figured that if the Japanese fleet was to sortie, it would likely come through the Palawan Passage. Not long after midnight, at 1:16 on the early morning of October 23rd, a radar operator in the conning tower of the Data called up to Commander David McClintock that he had a contact at 30,000 yards. "Probably just a rain cloud," said the radar man. "Raising cloud, hell," thought McClintock. "That's the Japanese fleet." The Data captain went below to have his suspicions confirmed. Numerous blips began appearing on the screen. Climbing back onto the conning tower bridge, he grabbed a megaphone and called out to his partner, Commander Bladen Claggett of the Dace. "Let's go," yelled McClintock to Claggett, who had been his classmate at the Naval Academy. The 2 subs ran south on the surface through the dark night, submerging before dawn. At first light, McClintock peered through his periscope and saw grey shapes forming in the mist. It was a column of Japanese warships. McClintock waited until the lead ship was almost on top of him, less than 1,000 yards away. "Fire one," he ordered. He could see that his target was a heavy cruiser. He hoped she was the flagship. He was in luck. Out of carelessness or fatalism, or perhaps out of habit, Kurita had put his own ship at the head of the column, without a sufficient destroyer screen. Aboard the Atago, a lookout sang out, 6 torpedo tracks, coming dead on. No time to evade. The officers of the flagship could only watch as 4 of the torpedoes buried themselves in the hull of the Fortago. Speaking to a friend years later, Admiral Kurita recalled the sound they made as the torpedoes struck, one after another. Dong, 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 dong. The Admiral knew almost instantly that his ship was doomed. He could hear the deep, grinding roar of bulkheads breaking, of rivets popping and bursting as steel gave way to the sea. As the Atago's bow began to settle and she heeled over, he announced, "This is it." There was no foolish discussion of the captain going down with the ship. Kurita turned to Captain Araki, the commanding officer of the Atago, and said simply, "It's time to go." As Kurita later recalled, he took off his shoes and was the first one over the side and into the water. Below the surface, a few hundred yards away, Commander McClintock swung his periscope to look at the cruiser he had just torpedoed. It was the sight of a lifetime, he later relished. The Atago filled his periscope lens. She was billowing black smoke and already down at the bow. Bursts of bright orange flame shot from her decks. Quartermaster Kosaku Koitabashi was deep in the bowels of the flagship, sitting at his duty station by the gyro compass on the lowest deck when the first torpedo struck. He heard a loud bang, then another, and at first thought the Atago must be attacking an enemy ship. Then came a third and a fourth explosion, which threw him from his seat and against a bulkhead. The lights flickered and went out. Plunged into complete darkness, Koitabashi realized that his ship had been badly hit, but he was unsure what to do. A Japanese sailor's first rule of combat was never to leave his duty station. On the other hand, he could hear water rushing somewhere nearby, and he could feel the ship begin to heel. For 10 long seconds he deliberated. Then he decided to try to save himself. He had to feel his way down a maze of passageways, through heavy bulkhead doors and up narrow ladders, heaving open steel hatches and closing them behind him as he struggled in the darkness to the main deck. He arrived gasping and barely able to stand up. Already the Atago was listing 30 degrees. He hurried to the bridge to find it almost deserted. His friend Nagaoka was still there. "What's going on?" Koitabashi asked. Nagaoka pointed in the early morning light to a scene of chaos on the surrounding sea. Hundreds of heads, like watermelons, Koitabashi recalled, were bobbing in the water as the Atagos officers and sailors swam for their lives. About 200 yards away, a destroyer, the Kishinami, was picking up survivors. The 2 petty officers decided to join them. Atago by now was heeling 70 degrees, close to capsizing. Koitabashi was able to walk off the slanting deck into the water, but before he went, he noticed an odd detail. Dozens of pairs of shoes had been neatly lined up along a bulkhead, left there by the fleeing crew of the sinking cruiser. Koitabashi recalled a cultural peculiarity of his people. If a Japanese man commits suicide, leaping off a bridge or a cliff or out a window, he is always careful to first take off his shoes. In the water, sailors were doing their duty. 2 officers struggled to swim while awkwardly holding aloft portraits of the Emperor and Empress, rescued from the officers' wardroom. A 17-year-old seaman held a rucksack over his head as he swam, but he began to flail and go under. He yelled out, "Here are coded messages from the HQs. Please take this." Hands reached out to help him. Admiral Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, was in the water, labouring to swim the last few yards to the Kishinami. He had hurt his leg, and his arms were heavy with exhaustion. He could see dozens of ropes dangling off the side of the destroyer, and oil-soaked sailors grasping for them, and trying to hold on as sailors' topside heaved. Koyanagi swam amidst a group of 4 or 5 sailors waiting their turn. An officer spotted him and commanded his men, "Get away, get away, let the chief of staff go up first." "Sir," the officer formally addressed Koyanagi, as they bobbed in the warm sea by the steep side of the destroyer, "please go up and continue the battle." Koyanagi was moved by the officer's sense of duty and protested, "Never mind, let the first one go on up, just go on," but the officer insisted. Koyanagi grasped the rope and was hauled to the deck, like a large, oily fish. Koyanagi found Admiral Kurita on the bridge. The commander of the 1st Diversionary Striking Force was trembling. The officers around him looked anxious. They knew the admiral was still recovering from dengue fever. Kurita's first words when arriving on the bridge of the Kishinami were, "Do you have whiskey?" A bottle was found. The admiral took 2 or 3 swigs, and his trembling seemed to stop. Kurita also needed some shoes. The only pair that fit was some white sneakers taken from an enlisted man. Kurita made a joke about being an admiral in sneakers. He looked seaward and did not see his flagship. She was gone, sunk in 19 minutes. Aboard the Yamato, Admiral Ugaki had been on the bridge at general quarters since an hour before dawn. He had watched, with horror, as the submarine attack unfolded. The fleet had picked up radio transmissions overnight, suggesting that American submarines might be lurking nearby, and the ships were zigzagging to make it more difficult for an unseen American sub to get a firing solution on a Japanese ship. The Yamato had just swung its enormous bow to port at 6:25, Ugaki recorded in his diary, when all of a sudden I saw the flame of an explosion and what seemed like a spread water column on the dawn sea. I shouted involuntarily, "Done it!" Ugaki could only watch as Otago staggered and began to sink. Suddenly, another cruiser, the Takao, went dead in the water and began to stream white smoke. A few minutes later came a spectacular explosion. The Maya, a 10,000-ton cruiser steaming right in front of the Yamato, blew up and disintegrated. Nothing was left after the smoke and spray subsided, wrote Ugaki. There was pandemonium throughout the fleet. False sightings of periscopes began pouring in. Ugaki estimated that the fleet was under attack by a wolf pack of 4 American submarines. Ships violently changed course and picked up speed. In the Dace, submerged nearby, Commander Claggett had been watching as he lined up his shot on the Maya. "It looks like the 4th of July out there," Claggett exulted to his crew. With Admiral Kurita swimming for his life or dead, Ugaki assumed command of the overall fleet, but there was not much he could do. The dangerous ground, with its uncharted rocks and shoals, threatened just to the west, while Ugaki could see the mountains of Palawan silhouetted against the eastern sky. He had little room to maneuver. For the rest of the morning, destroyers raced about dropping depth charges and responding to 7 more submarine alarms, all false. Finally, at 3:40 in the afternoon, the Kishinami was able to come alongside the Yamato and transfer Admiral Kurita, dried out and fortified by a couple of belts of whiskey, and his staff. On the bridge of the Yamato, Ugaki greeted Kurita with an uncharacteristic smile. "Ugaki-kun," Kurita said to his number 2, using the kun address for a subordinate, "we were pretty well beaten up." Ugaki responded, "Commander, the battle has just begun." Ugaki had to make an effort to appear glad to see his commander-in-chief. He did not have a high opinion of Kurita, and his own place was diminished by Kurita's arrival. He had to relinquish his monkey seat, the top commander's chair, on the right side of the bridge to Commander-in-Chief Kurita. Quartermaster Koitabashi, along with most of the enlisted men from the Atago's bridge detail, had accompanied Admiral Kurita to the Yamato, which now became the fleet's flagship. Koitabashi recalled the feeling of tension as the staffs of the 2 admirals awkwardly mingled and sorted out duties and accommodations. Now that the Yamato was the flagship, Ugaki and his staff would be effectively marginalized. Ugaki would still command the 1st Battleship Division, but as a practical matter, Kurita and his staff would be in control on the crowded bridge. Not all of Kurita's staff had made it to Yamato. Some critical signals specialists had died on board or drowned or been rescued by other ships. For communications, Kurita would have to rely on Ugaki's staff. The radio and telegraph equipment on Japanese ships was often poor. The unfamiliar staff would add to the fog of war. Writing in his diary that night, Ugaki stiffly acknowledged his changed circumstances. "This may be fate," he wrote, though his feelings were best expressed by the question he used to open his diary entry for October 23rd. Could there be any worse day than today? The mood among his fellow officers was no better. Muffled derision greeted a cable that arrived shortly after 5 p.m. from Combined Fleet Headquarters. Tokyo concluded that it is very probable that the enemy is aware that we have concentrated our forces. That was darkly amusing to the assembled officers, some of them in borrowed dry clothes after their morning's swim. The cable went on to predict, in essence, disaster. The enemy would probably concentrate submarines in the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits area, the two straits the Japanese would have to force to gain entry to Leyte Gulf. The Americans would plan attacks on our surface forces, using large type planes and task forces, after tomorrow morning, and plan decisive action by concentrating his surface strength to the east of Leyte Gulf. A warm welcome. And the Japanese plan? Carry through with our original plans, Combined Fleet Headquarters ordered. The IJN staff officers, safe in their bunker in a Tokyo suburb, emphasized the importance of the deception, luring the American carriers north with Admiral Ozawa's decoy operation, and called for an even stricter alert against submarines and aircraft. Tokyo also called on shore-based planes to destroy enemy task force. That was also good for a stifled laugh. What shore-based planes? Most of the officers knew that the Air Force had been fairly well obliterated, though few were aware of Admiral Onishi's plan to turn some of the few that remained into kamikazes. Ugaki caught the mood. He ended his diary entry, "A bad day is a bad day to the end." The messages from the Dace and the Data, warning of the advance of Kurita's fleet, began arriving in flag plot aboard USS New Jersey at 6:20 on the morning of October 23rd. Halsey had arisen at 5 a.m. after no more than a couple of hours of sleep and performed his normal and elaborate morning ablutions. He had been served breakfast powdered eggs. The real ones had run out by his Filipino steward, Benedicto Tulao, and he appeared tireless but crisp in pressed khakis, showered and freshly shaved with his hair slicked back. After 6 weeks of more or less constant combat operations, he was tired. Judging from the letters his doctor, Khan's Piggy Weeks, was sending home describing the Admiral's health, he was not feeling well. Halsey and most of his staff were suffering from, or were just recovering from, the flu. Smoking Lucky Strikes from his first of 2 to 3 packs a day and sipping his second or third of 10 daily cups of muddy coffee, Admiral Halsey spread the messages in front of him on the wardroom table. The first secret urgent signal from the submariners reported 3 possible battleships. The next sighting reported 9 ships and many radars. Then, minimum 11 ships. Same course, same speed. Halsey told his staff Lieutenant Bill Kitchell to summon a meeting of the Department of Dirty Tricks. Halsey and his staff pondered the significance of the sightings by the 2 submarines. Was it possible that the Japanese fleet was coming out to challenge the American invasion after all? The half-dozen officers around the table, weary middle-aged men worn by strain, illness, and lack of sleep, their faded khakis already showing sweat stains in the dense humidity, were doubtful. It was hard to imagine that the Japanese would be so rash, not after their air forces had taken such a beating over Formosa just the week before. Halsey still lusted for the chance to wipe out the Japanese fleet, but he had a hard time believing that Tokyo would be brave or foolhardy enough to give him the opportunity. Even so, 11 ships, at least 3 of them battleships, if the submariners were right, amounted to a formidable force. And yet, the combined wisdom of the intelligence analysts working for General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz had predicted that the Japanese Navy would not seriously challenge the American landings at Leyte Gulf. What to make of the battle wagons spotted by the Data and the Dace? Halsey was not the only fleet commander tracking the Japanese movements. The 7th Fleet, MacArthur's navy, of old battleships and small jeep carriers floated off the invasion beach, supporting the landings with gunfire and strafing and bombing runs. Aboard his flagship at anchor in Leyte Gulf, Admiral Thomas Kincaid, the commander of the 7th Fleet, weighed in with his prediction. In a message to all commanders MacArthur, King, Nimitz and Halsey sent shortly after 10 a.m., Kincaid suggested that the Japanese warships were headed to the Philippines to stage what Kincaid called a magnified Tokyo Express, the old Japanese standby from Guadalcanal days. The Tokyo Express had been essentially an armed troop train. Many nights, like clockwork, the Japanese had run troop-filled destroyers down the slot from the Japanese citadel at Rabaul to reinforce the Japanese troops besieging Henderson Field. Kincaid guessed the ship movements detected by the Dace and Data presaged more of the same. Kincaid suggested that by sea, under cover of night, the The Japanese were planning to run reinforcements to their troops battling the invading American forces at Leyte. The mood of the Dirty Tricks Department was anxious, but not overly so. A Tokyo Express, even a magnified one, would be a nuisance. Everyone in Halsey's wardroom agreed. But it would not greatly test a navy that had mushroomed since those precarious first innings in the South Seas. At Guadalcanal in the late summer of 1942, the USS Navy had withdrawn its 3 carriers from the invasion area for fear of losing them. A little more than 2 years later, Halsey's task force boasted 18 fast carriers, as well as half a dozen battleships. And that did not count the 6 old battleships and 18 small auxiliary or jeep carriers of Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet. At this stage of the war, the American Navy had more destroyers than Admiral Ozawa's carriers had warplanes, while American factories were turning out planes at the rate of about 1 every 5 minutes. Halsey and his men did not quite understand the extent of their superiority, but they were confident, if not cocky, about their ability to outgun the Japanese. The more difficult question was whether they could outthink an enemy they did not fully understand. In the smoky wardroom of the New Jersey, dankly hot by 10 a.m., despite the droning of the forced air blowers, Halsey's chief planner Marine Gen. Bill Riley hazarded a more ominous guess. Riley was known as Halsey's drinking buddy, but he was also the officer most likely to ask creative questions. Riley was the first one to figure out the Japanese plan. He wondered aloud, what if the Japanese aimed to attack the American transports sitting in Leyte Gulf? There was some history to suggest that the Japanese might try. In the early days at Guadalcanal, the Japanese had sent a battle fleet steaming toward the invasion beaches, apparently intent upon shooting up the landing forces. In a classic night action, the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese fleet had sunk 4 Allied, 3 American, 1 Australian cruisers. After the battle, the Japanese had inexplicably withdrawn, rather than press ahead to sink the vulnerable transports. But what if this time was different? What if the Japanese aimed to send heavy gunships right at the beachhead? Halsey could remember how the Japanese brazenly shelled Henderson Field in October 1942. On several other occasions, the Japanese had sent ships in close to shore to bombard American forces. Still, to try anything like that now, given the strength of the Navy's defences, Halsey reasoned, would be madness. Halsey's chief of staff, Admiral Mick Carney, spoke up last. What if the Japanese decided to shoot the works, send the entire fleet to take on the American naval forces in a great and final sea battle? Halsey said he didn't think so. He did not state his reasons, but Halsey's views on the Japanese did not need an airing. The Japanese may have been crazed, they may have mounted banzai charges with bamboo sticks, but they were not the supermen of America's post, Pearl Harbor imaginings. To Halsey, the Japanese were still little people. They lacked a capacity for greatness. Halsey concluded that the Japanese were running some kind of Tokyo Express. At the same time, he wondered, not for the first time, where were the Japanese carriers? The submarines had spotted battleships, but no flat tops, the greatest threats, and, to aviators like Halsey, the true heart of Japan's remaining naval power. The Japanese carriers had been last reported in Japan's inland sea, but had they sallied forth? Watching from his chair, Lieutenant Carl Solberg, the Oxford-educated air combat intelligence officer, noticed that Chief of Staff Carney had a way of pushing up his glasses on his balding forehead when there was nothing left to be said. The Department of Dirty Tricks quieted. Scowling, pushing up his glasses, Carney summed up the situation. Japanese battleships were approaching the Philippines. At the very least, the Third Fleet needed to gird for some kind of confrontation. Worried about his pilots, so exhausted that many were cracking up or on the verge, Halsey had ordered 2 carrier groups to retire to Ulithi, the sandy atoll where ships could resupply, and the men could drink a warm beer or 2 and go for a swim. Now Halsey cancelled those orders for one of the carrier groups. Admiral R. E. Davison's Task Group 38.4 comprised of the carriers Enterprise, Franklin, San Jacinto, and Belleau Wood, but he allowed another, Admiral John S. Slew McCain's Task Group 38.1, with carriers Wasp, Hornet, Hancock, Monterey, and Cowpens, to continue on to Ulithi for resupply and R&R. McCain's 5 ships carried roughly 400, or 2/5, of the Third Fleet's 1,000 warplanes. Their absence would seriously diminish Halsey's resources and limit his flexibility. Still, Halsey felt confident that he had enough left to handle a magnified Tokyo Express if one was coming their way. Halsey ordered the remaining carrier groups to close on the Philippine shore and prepare for action. At dawn on the morning of October 24th, the Third Fleet sent search flights racing to the west, looking for the Japanese ships. Aboard the New Jersey, flag plot was noisy, crowded, Lieutenant Solberg recalled, and tense. Halsey, Carney, and a dozen others listened to the pilots' voices piped into the room on loudspeakers. Anxiously, men kept looking at their watches and saying, "It's about time." Where was the Japanese fleet? Weather was not helping. The remnants of a front still lingered south of Manila, and the pilots were reporting cloud cover. Then, at 8:20, came the break. Lieutenant Bill Verity, flying a Grumman fighter from the aircraft carrier Cabot, shouted out, "I see he was flying off Mindoro Island at the edge of the Sibuyan Sea, an inner sea in the Philippine archipelago, the likely passage a Japanese fleet would take to advance toward the American landing beaches on the other side of Leyte." "Big ships!" yelled Verity. Everyone in flag plot quieted and listened. 2 minutes later came the voice of Commander, Mort Eslick of the Intrepid's bombing group 18. The pilot's voice, Solberg recalled, was loud, clear, and very cool. Eslick gave a count. 4 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, and 13 destroyers course east, off the southern tip of Mindoro. The Department of Dirty Tricks quickly did the math. 25 ships, not the 11 reported by the Dason data. This was no magnified Tokyo Express. The Japanese appeared to be committing their main battle fleet. Eslick's count was close. Kurita's fleet at that moment numbered 28 ships, including 5 battleships. Halsey took no time in deciding what to do. Officially, Halsey was overall commander of the Third Fleet, but tactical control of the fast carrier task force belonged to Admiral Mark Mitcher. If Halsey had been following proper procedure, he would at least have consulted with Mitcher before giving an order, but Halsey was not a by-the-book man, and there was no time to waste. In one swift motion, he cut Mitcher out of the chain of command. At 8:37, picking up a radiophone receiver for a communication net known as TBS Talk Between Ships, Halsey commanded, in what he called his best radio voice, "Strike, repeat, strike, good luck." Halsey, not for the first time, was being self-conscious about his own legend. As Solberg later wrote, Halsey's order was greeted with cheers on all the ships of the force. Everyone caught the resounding echo of his famous radio to his beleaguered carriers as he took command at Noumea in the South Pacific's darkest hours. Strike, repeat, strike. At 8:46, Halsey ordered Admiral McCain's carrier group to reverse course and prepare to refuel at sea. Halsey realized he would need all of his carrier planes. McCain's force was already 600 miles away. It would take him more than a day to return. The search planes from Halsey's fleet appeared as blips on the Yamato radar screen at dawn. As the sun rose, the heavy cloud cover blew away, and the ocean turned a brilliant blue, a kind of deep, almost iridescent turquoise. Fluffy clouds floated by, dappling the water. A steady but gentle breeze raised the occasional whitecap. The islands of the Philippine archipelago, lush and green, rose out of the sea in volcanic cones. Both the Japanese sailors and the American flyers would remember the incongruous beauty of the day. At 8:20, standing on the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita sighted 3 American planes to the north. The search planes flew in groups of 3, 2 fighters and a bomber. One of them was Lieutenant Verity's plane. The tension rose on the bridge, recalled Admiral Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, who was standing behind his commander. Everyone on the bridge was already exhausted. After the sinking of the Atago and the Maya the day before, lookouts were on edge and saw periscopes everywhere. Destroyers had raced about all day and all night, dropping depth charges on phantoms. The crew of the Yamato had been called to general quarters at dawn, interrupting their simple breakfast of rice and dried fish. Most of the men would not eat again until nightfall, when they would be fed rice balls as they stood at their battle stations. At last, shortly after 10:30 a.m., the Americans arrived in force. From the east, 30 planes, fighters Hellcats, dive bombers Helldivers, and torpedo bombers Avengers, could be seen, breaking tight formation as the bombers commenced their runs. From the bridge of his super battleship, Petty Officer Koitabashi watched in awe as the Yamato 150 anti-aircraft guns, sticking up like needles on a porcupine, spewed out 12,000 shells a minute. Red tracers filled the sky. The rain of shells was so thick it reminded Koitabashi of a tropical storm. In their proper circular formation, with the destroyers forming an outer ring and the larger cruisers surrounding the battleships at the center, Kurita's fleet could put out a nearly impenetrable screen of fire. But as the ships began to twist and turn to evade torpedo tracks, the curtain parted. The American planes fearlessly bore in, junking and bombing or just flying low and straight on their torpedo runs. Pressing its attack, one dive bomber flew right between the Yamato towering forward superstructure and the ship's huge, swept-back smokestack. Koitabashi was stunned. We had been educated that the Americans had no guts, he recalled. But my goodness, they came so close. Aside from hearing the gossip at the tobacco bon, Koitabashi had depended for news of the war on Radio Tokyo and Japanese newspapers faithfully delivered, a few weeks late, to the fleet. Any newspaperman who praised the enemy's performance was officially branded a traitor, so the Japanese press never reported American success or improvement. Sailors like Koitabashi had to learn firsthand. The effect, especially when the Japanese compared the performance of the Americans with their own, was disillusioning and demoralizing. After the submarine attacks on Otago and Maya, staff officers had been heard grumbling, "It's too bad our own subs can't pull off an attack like that." And yet the super battleships, at least, seemed indomitable. So many times Koitabashi and the other petty officers, like Japanese schoolchildren everywhere, had sung the rousing battleship march defending or attacking like a floating fortress of steel. So dependable. The crews of the Yamato and Musashi had been told repeatedly that their ships were unsinkable. On the Musashi, sailors learned a litany that perfectly captured Japan's lethal brew of overconfidence and fatalism. The Musashi is unsinkable. If it sinks, Japan will sink with it. And if Japan falls, we should all go down with it. When Koitabashi had come aboard Yamato after swimming off the Atago and riding cooped up with other survivors aboard a destroyer, he had immediately seen why the ship had acquired the moniker Hotel Yamato. Bullets from strafing airplanes seemed to rattle off the ship's armor plating. Koitabashi watched as machine gun bullets from the buzzing American planes chewed up the wooden planks on the main deck. They barely dented the battleship, except to expose the steel plating beneath. Still, there were casualties. A lookout standing on the wing of the bridge took a bullet and slumped over. Koitabashi, held in reserve along with the rest of the bridge detail from the sunken Otago, stepped into his place, taking over the high-powered binoculars. Koitabashi had been to sea for 6 years, but he had never been in an attack like this. He was frightened, he recalled many years later, but at the same time he was thrilled. The officers maintained their usual impassive expressions. Admiral Ugaki's diary entry for that morning reflected an almost haughty disdain, like the hungry samurai picking his teeth. At 10:40, when I was thinking it was about time for the guests to come, 25 of them came in. We shot down a few F-6F's Hellcats and TBF's Avengers and thought nothing of them. At noon, the Americans came again. Enormous geysers erupted around the Musashi as a pair of torpedoes buried their heads in her bow. Unshaken, she ploughed ahead at 24 knots. But from the Yamato, Kurita and the other senior officers noticed something odd. Her bow wave was now a giant cataract of water, a rooster tail that spewed up and out. He commanders did not know it at that moment, but they were watching blood pour from an Achilles heel. The super battleships were like citadels wrapped in thick steel belts, but the heavy side armor stopped abreast the foremost main battery turret, making the bow, affixed with the proud imperial chrysanthemum, vulnerable to the Americans' high-explosive torpedoes the duds of the early war had been fixed. Aboard the Musashi, steel plate had been bent out by the force of the explosion, creating the telltale bow wave. Water was slowly flooding the Musashi forward compartments. Aboard the Musashi, known to her crew as the Palace, the gunnery officer asked permission to open up on the American planes with their giant 18-inch guns. The guns had been supplied with shells, called sanshikidan, filled with tiny incendiary bombs that would scatter and explode amidst attacking planes. But the captain of the Musashi, Admiral Toshihira Inoguchi, refused the request. The anti-aircraft shells might damage the rifled bores of the giant guns. He wanted to save his firepower for a truer test, shooting against enemy ships. From the high bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita watched wordlessly as the American planes broke off their attack and disappeared back over the eastern horizon. He knew that more were coming. He had little useful intelligence. The weather front had interfered with Japanese scout planes flying out of Manila. But Kurita had no doubt that Halsey's task forces were out there somewhere, and it was apparent from the bombs exploding around him that the Americans had found their enemy. Admiral Nishimura, commanding the smaller southern arm of the 1st Diversionary Striking Force's pincer movement, scheduled to advance on Leyte through the Surigao Strait, was reporting that he too was under attack. Kurita had not heard a word from Admiral Ozawa, whose decoy fleet was supposedly luring away Halsey's carriers somewhere to the north, though not very effectively, judging from the swarms of American carrier planes descending on Kurita's ships. Kurita had been radioing Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo and 1st Air Fleet Headquarters in Manila since 8 o'clock in the morning, requesting air cover. He had received no response. The answer, he bitterly understood, was all too clear. The empty skies overhead, not a sign of a Japanese plane, were an open invitation to the Americans to return and attack at their leisure. Kurita could hear his staff grumbling that if the attacks kept up, the fleet would be reduced by half before it ever reached its target. Already, one cruiser had been sent limping back to port, escorted by 2 destroyers. The operations chief, Captain Otani, was discussing, in a tentative way, the possibility of turning around and withdrawing, at least to get out of range of the Americans and regroup while the rest of the show plan had time to do its job, to divert Halsey's fleet with Ozawa's half-empty carriers or attack it with shore-based planes. Kurita decided to send a message to his superiors. It was a request for information intended, in a classically Japanese roundabout way, to shame them. We are being subjected to repeated enemy carrier-based air attacks. Advise immediately of contacts and attacks made by you on the enemy. Kurita received no answer. After the war, Admiral Fukudome, commander of land-based air forces, admitted that he turned a deaf ear to Kurita's requests. Lieutenant Nick Fellner, a young American Navy pilot, was captivated by tension, fear, anticipation, and oddly by beauty, as he pushed his dive bomber along at 12,000 feet above the green islands and deep blue water of the Sibuyan Sea, the snaking inland sea that confined Kurita's ships as they struggled eastward toward the elusive, decisive battle. A pilot in a bomber squadron off the carrier Franklin, Fellner was flying in a wave of 30 planes, the 4th attack to hit Kurita's force that day, and the 2nd in less than an hour. The surrounding scene was peaceful. Fellner could hear nothing but the sleepy drone of his engine. Then, ahead, beyond a few fleecy white clouds, he could see a strange, almost festive sight. Thousands of tiny puffs of coloured smoke, red, blue, green, and yellow and red streaks and sparks. He was looking at the Japanese fleet's anti-aircraft barrage, lofted by more than a score of ships, each with about 100 guns pointed skyward. A rainbow rain of death, he thought to himself, and pointed his nose down for the 70-degree dive into the maelstrom. The time was 2:26 p.m. in the afternoon. Below was a magnificent, dramatic sight. The white wakes of great grey warships swirled and twisted as the ships manoeuvred to evade the American bombs and torpedoes. Fellner fastened on the biggest ship, a ship he had never seen before, not even in a photograph. Few Americans had. The Office of Naval Intelligence had printed artist renderings of the super battleships, which the pilots used to practice ship identification. Dive bomber pilots are supposed to fly straight down, but Fellner spiraled and twisted to keep the massive ship in his gun sight as she made a tight turn. As his altitude gauge passed 1,000 feet and colourful blossoms violently exploded all around him, he pickled his bomb, releasing it. Almost as an afterthought, he fired his machine guns and 20mm cannon, not really to do any damage, he later recalled, but for the sheer sense of elation. Then he pulled back on his joystick, and like all dive bomber pilots, passed out for several seconds from the intense G-forces as his plane clawed above the anti-aircraft fire and levelled off. When the Helldiver pilots returned to their carriers, the wings of their planes were smouldering from bits of the phosphorus used in Japanese shells. Fellner's 1,000-pound bomb pierced the deck of the Yamato near the bow and penetrated through 5 decks. When it exploded, it blew 2 holes below the waterline in the side of the ship, 6 square feet on one side, 24 square feet on the other. The great ship shuddered and began to heel slightly, but did not slow. As one of the bow compartments filled with water, a damage control officer opened valves to flood a compartment on the other side with 3,000 tons of water. The Yamato righted and ploughed on. The crew of the Yamato did not flinch. The days and nights of training, reinforced by petty officers wielding spirit bars, worked to maintain discipline. Morale among the enlisted men did not flag, even though their casualties were mounting. Jiro Iwasa, a young reconnaissance pilot, had gone to the deck to watch the action and had been wounded slightly in the thigh. He watched as some sailors gathered up body parts and placed them in a large bathtub. An orderly was carrying a bucket filled with rice balls on girt, which he handed out to sailors as they stood at their battle stations. Iwasa recoiled as he saw one sailor hungrily eat a rice ball that had somehow become coated with human blood. Iwasa, without any duty to perform, decided to go lie in his bunk in the gunroom. The Musashi was in worse shape. Her torn bow was ploughing up water in a great geyser. The bombs that nearly missed the ship still threw sheets of water and shrapnel across her decks and into exposed gun tubs. The great ship had been torpedoed 9 times. She began to slow and drop behind, struggling to maintain 12 knots while the rest of the fleet pushed ahead at 22 knots. From the bridge of the Flagship, Ugaki watched, stone-faced, as Yamato great sister ship began to lose the fight. Across the bridge, Admiral Kurita was not sentimental. He gave the order for the Musashi to retire from the fleet and withdraw to Coron Bay, a safe harbour if there were such places in the western Philippines. All along the Yamato, men were ordered to come to attention as the Musashi, the unsinkable symbol of national pride, turned her lowering bow and retreated toward safety. It was too late. At 3:10 in the afternoon, a 5th wave of American planes descended on the Japanese fleet. It was the biggest attack yet, about 100 planes. They circled the Musashi, like wolves finishing off a straggler from the flock. Bomb hits sprayed shrapnel across the decks, cutting down sailors who wore Hachimaki victory headbands, patterned after the white cloths that ancient samurai wore around their heads, signifying their expectation of death. American sailors, by contrast, wore metal helmets. Fragments like steel popcorn ricocheted off the bridge. 10 more torpedoes thudded into the sides of the great Leviathan. Finally, with his ship's life at stake, Admiral Inoguchi gave his gunnery officer permission to use his massive 18-inch guns as anti-aircraft guns. They had never been fired at a ship, and now they never would. They were not very effective against airplanes. From the Yamato, Ugaki watched as the Musashi 3 turrets wheeled and their gun barrels belched flame. It was regrettable to see that the number of enemy planes shot down was small, he would write in his diary that night. The great ship was listing to port. A battleship can keep an even keel by flooding compartments, but the damage control officer was reporting that he was running out of available space to fill with seawater. Admiral Inoguchi decided to flood one of his engine rooms, even though it meant killing scores of men trapped in an inner compartment. Fires were breaking out all over the ship, the sick bay filled with carbon monoxide, snuffing out the wounded. A bomb tore through the bridge of Musashi, killing most of the officers. Admiral Inoguchi was spared. He was standing atop the bridge on a special platform used by commanders aboard Japanese ships under air attack. They would point with a baton, like the conductor in an orchestra, to direct the ship's evasive maneuvers. But shrapnel swept across the observation tower, slicing into Inoguchi's shoulder. The ship was by now almost helpless, decks awash. Suddenly, for no apparent reason, sailors, those who were still alive, began to cry banzai. Someone had started a rumor that the entire American fleet had been destroyed, and it quickly spread through the ship. On the bridge of the Yamato, Kurita's staff knew the fleet was in trouble. Captain Otani, Kurita's operations officer, had been quietly but persistently badgering his commander to turn around the fleet, to withdraw, at least for a time. Before darkness fell in 2 hours, Tani reasoned, the Americans could launch another 3 attacks. It was time to pull back. Kurita was not ready to abandon the mission, though the futility of it was becoming increasingly obvious. Perhaps, his staff argued or rationalized, withdrawing temporarily would work as a feint to convince the Americans that the Japanese were retreating. Just as important, it would send a signal to combined fleet headquarters in Tokyo that unless a way was found to provide air cover, the whole mission was doomed. Kurita listened impassively to his staff's argument and finally nodded his assent. Otani dictated a message to a signalman to be sent to Tokyo. The fleet was turning around, to temporarily retire beyond the range of enemy planes and reform our plans. Otani's message described the heavy air attacks and the damage that had forced the Musashi and a heavy cruiser, the Miyoko, to limp for port. The operations chief, writing for Kurita's signature, explained in unusually graphic terms, "Under these circumstances, it was deemed that were we to force our way through, we would merely make of ourselves meat for the enemy, with very little chance of success." Kurita and his staff later claimed that they were completely without air cover throughout the slaughter in the Sibuyan Sea, and it may have seemed that way to them. From airfields in the Philippines, a total of 10 Japanese planes had flown out to protect Kurita's fleet. 4 of them were shot down. One of the others was piloted by Commander Iki Haruki. At the very beginning of the Pacific War, Commander Haruki had been one of the pilots who dropped the bombs that sank the British dreadnought Prince of Wales and the battle-cruiser Repulse. Haruki had a sentimental streak, and after he had helped destroy the British capital ships, he had flown back out over the sea to the spot, a smear of oil and flotsam, where the British warships and 840 of their officers and sailors had perished. Looking down from the cockpit of his plane, Haruki had dropped a bouquet of flowers to honor his fallen comrades. 4 Japanese planes had been lost, and the enemy dead. How long ago that day seemed, Haruki thought. How distant were those noble feelings of elation and gallantry. Now, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, Commander Haruki flew far above Kurita's fleet as it twisted in agony beneath the attack of the marauding Americans. Haruki could have sacrificed himself as a final gesture. Instead, he turned the nose of his plane and flew away. From his bunker at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Toyoda had, not unreasonably, wanted to go on the offensive with what little air power he had left. He had made only a handful of planes available to defend Kurita's fleet, but the Navy had cobbled together about 200 planes, based at airfields around Manila, to attack Halsey's carriers as they floated, in 3 separate groups spread over 100 miles, in the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. The northernmost group, Task Group 38.3 under Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, was preparing to launch its planes to attack Kurita's fleet when, shortly after 8 a.m., radar picked up a large blob of bogies, enemy planes, to the northwest. Administrator Mark Mitcher, the overall commander of the carriers in Halsey's fleet, was aboard his flagship, the Lexington, attached to Sherman's Task Group 38.3. He sent out the signal, "Hey Rube!" the old circus cry for help, adopted by the Navy when its ships came under attack. The carriers in Sherman's group scrambled to launch fighters to repel the invaders. The Japanese pilots were a motley crew, mostly inexperienced and undertrained, and a single American pilot, Commander. David McCampbell, off the Essex, was able to cut out and shoot down no fewer than 9 Japanese planes. His wingman got 6. But at about 9:30, a Judy bomber dropped out of a rain cloud and deposited a 500-pound bomb on the flight deck of the light carrier Princeton. The blast started a fire that set off a string of torpedoes in the bomb bays of Avengers waiting to take off. The carrier burned and then blew apart, slaughtering dozens still aboard, and more than 200 men on a cruiser, the Birmingham, which had come alongside to help. Aboard the New Jersey, sailing 50 miles to the south with Admiral Jerry Bogan's Task Group 38.2, Admiral Halsey did not know that the planes attacking Sherman's carrier group had been land-based. He guessed wrongly that they had flown from Japanese carriers. As always, Halsey was fixated on finding and sinking the Japanese carrier force. His staff was no less impatient and determined. Again and again, Halsey's top staffer for air operations, Commander Doug Moulton, pounded the table in flag plot and demanded, "Where in the hell are those goddamn carriers?" During the course of the day, Moulton must have said this 50 times. Halsey later wrote, "The intelligence on the Japanese carriers was thin." That morning, an aide handed Halsey a red top-secret folder containing ultra material. decrypts of Japanese signals sent from the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor. By monitoring the messages sent to Japanese oil tankers, the codebreakers had determined that Admiral Ozawa's carriers had left their safe haven of the inland sea in Japan and sortied through the Bungo Straits into the Pacific. But where? The best estimate was the Formosa Philippine Sea area, not a very precise description. The Department of Dirty Tricks pondered this intriguing scrap. Halsey's self-effacing naval intelligence officer, Mike Cheek, studied the document and, in his reticent way, wrote Halsey a little note rather than speak up at the table. Cheek's note predicted that the Japanese carriers were coming south looking for Halsey's Third Fleet. Cheek's quiet assessment was lost in Moulton's bellowing about finding those goddamn carriers. As the Dirty Tricks Department was trying to find Ozawa, Admiral Ozawa was trying to be found. His force, a heavy carrier, 3 light carriers, and 2 hermaphrodites, battleships with short runways attached to the stern, was making as much noise as possible. Following the vast deception that was at the heart of the show plan, Ozawa was trying to lure Halsey away to the north. He needed to get Halsey's attention by nightfall, in order to allow Admiral Kurita's remaining battleships and escorts to slip in behind, through the San Bernardino Strait and down the east side of Samar Island into Leyte Gulf. Ozawa was committing suicide with his fleet. He had brimmed with self-sacrificing spirit when he bade farewell to Admiral Toyoda. "He shall disregard any damage which may be inflicted upon my force in this operation," he had announced to the C&C before setting sail on October 20th. Ozawa was flooding the airwaves with telltale radio signals, or rather he thought he was. He did not know that the radio antenna on his ship, the carrier Zuikaku, was broken. Though American carriers were only about 200 miles away, they could not hear any radio signals from Ozawa, and so far their search planes had not found the Japanese carriers. Ozawa's men had no illusions that they were anything other than cannon fodder. The carriers, once the heart of Japan's naval might, were now decoys. Their decks were more than 2/3 empty of planes. Ozawa had managed to put together an odd-lot collection of 108 fighters and bombers, many flown by pilots who could not return because they did not know how to land on a carrier deck. Shortly before noon on October 24th, Ozawa launched 76 of his planes against the American carriers bombed earlier that morning by the Philippines-based planes. He also ordered his 2 hermaphrodite battleships, the Ise and Hyuga, to steam south and engage the enemy. The orders reveal the Imperial Navy's willful, almost pathological denial. The 2 Japanese ships were instructed to mop up the remnants of the American fleet. As the Japanese planes took off from the Zuikaku, Admiral Ozawa stood on the flight deck in the bright midday sun and saluted. Then he looked away. He ordered the planes to make for bases on land, though he knew that many of them would never get that far. Ducking in and out of rain showers, Admiral Sherman first spotted the Japanese attackers at 1:31 that afternoon. He radioed Halsey that the planes were approaching not from land, not from the Philippines in the west, but rather from the northeast, suggesting that they had been launched by carriers at sea. Aboard the New Jersey, Halsey was increasingly convinced that he would be engaging his long-sought foe in a matter of hours, if he could only find the carriers. At the same time, he had to worry about Admiral Kurita's fleet coming through the San Bernardino Strait and descending on MacArthur's landing ships, as General Riley had warned the day before at the War Council of the Department of Dirty Tricks. Halsey's first responsibility was to safeguard the invasion fleet. True, he had a loophole. His orders specifically stated that if the opportunity to destroy a major portion of the Japanese fleet presented itself, such destruction becomes the primary task. To Halsey, the carriers qualified as the major portion of the Japanese fleet, but he needed to prepare for all eventualities, to be ready to plug the San Bernardino Strait, as well as to plunge north to engage the carriers. At 3:12 in the afternoon of October 24th, Halsey issued a message that would be the cause of a fatal misunderstanding. The message was labelled Battle Plan. It instructed Admiral Willis Lee to form a battle line made up of 4 of the Third Fleet's 6 battleships, the New Jersey, Lower, Washington, and Alabama, together with 5 cruisers and 19 destroyers. The battle line, dubbed Task Force 34, would engage the enemy at long ranges. The coded telegram was sent throughout the Third Fleet, as well as to Admiral King, the Navy's commander-in-chief in Washington, and to Admiral Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, based at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. It was not addressed to Admiral Kincaid, the commander of the 7th Fleet, who was floating on his flagship, the Wasatch, in Leyte Gulf. Halsey was not obliged to contact Kincaid. Indeed, he was prohibited from direct communication with the 7th Fleet's commander, who was in General MacArthur's chain of command. Ever jealous of his power, MacArthur did not want any back channels between old Navy mates. Halsey and Kincaid communicated with each other through a clumsy, maddeningly slow process, designed to make sure that MacArthur saw all the message traffic. If Kincaid wanted to pass information to Halsey, or vice versa, he had to send it to a radio station on the island of Manus. From there, it was retransmitted on something called the Fox schedule that went to all ships and all headquarters. Commanders were expected to decode messages only if they carried the call sign of their ship or force. The fact that Halsey did not send Kincaid his battle plan to create Task Force 34 did not stop Kincaid from finding out about it. He intercepted the message and, in essence, eavesdropped. It was common practice among ship and fleet commanders to pull down and decode messages addressed to others, and so Kincaid had no scruple about listening in on Halsey's communications. Indeed, Kincaid was delighted to read Halsey's message. It suited his own plans perfectly. Earlier that morning, planes from Halsey's carriers had spotted Admiral Nishimura's small fleet making for Surigao Strait. From his command post at Leyte Gulf, Admiral Kincaid had quickly grasped that the Japanese intended a pincer movement, Kurita's large fleet coming through the San Bernardino Strait to the north, and Nishimura's smaller force, 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 4 destroyers coming through Surigao Strait to the south. It was obvious that they planned to converge in Leyte Gulf to attack MacArthur's invasion ships. Kincaid immediately sent word to the commander of his gunships, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, to take his fleet and prepare for a night battle. Of Oldendorf's 6 battleships, 4, the Pennsylvania, Tennessee, West Virginia, and California, had all been badly damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Salvaged from the mud and repaired, they were old and slow, and not much use for anything more than bombarding beaches during invasions. But they had a score to settle, and they could be arrayed across the Surigao Strait to blast any Japanese ship that tried to come through. Kincaid decided that he did not need to worry about San Bernardino Strait to the north. Halsey had that covered with his battle plan, or so Kincaid assumed. In war, as in almost everything else, assumption is the mother of error. Kincaid did not know it, but Halsey had not actually given a formal order to form Task Force 34. Rather, the battle plan was only a contingency. Halsey sent out another signal a few minutes later, telling his commanders that Task Force 34 will be formed when directed by me, in other words, if and when it was necessary, and only at Halsey's further command. But he sent this message by TBS talk between ships, by short-range radio. Kincaid never heard it, nor did Nimitz nor King, and these commanders too believed that Halsey was forming Task Force 34 and intending to position it at the mouth of the San Bernardino Strait as a welcoming committee for Admiral Kurita's fleet. Kincaid was no more guilty of making assumptions than his superiors. This misunderstanding was caused, or at the very least exacerbated, by poor grammar. The battle plan read like a command Task Force 34 will be formed. But in the Navy, as naval historian Tom Cutler has pointed out, verb tenses are sometimes misused for effect. Good discipline will be maintained doesn't mean sometime in the future, it means now. Since Halsey specified no exact time to form Task Force 34, Kincaid and Nimitz assumed that he meant right away. Halsey could be loose with his language. His staff, particularly his Chief of Staff, Admiral Kearney, should have guarded against such imprecision. He surely should have sent Halsey's clarifying follow-up message. Task Force 34 will be formed when directed by me, to Nimitz, King, and Kincaid. But Kearney, a fairly literate man, was sick and exhausted, just like his boss. Halsey's poor staff work was partly to blame. Even so, Kincaid and his staff showed a startling lack of curiosity, an odd passivity in not communicating with Halsey to make sure that the San Bernardino Strait was covered. Personal feelings may have come into play. Kincaid did not like Halsey. Aside from the fact that both men had bushy eyebrows and graduated in the bottom half of the class at Annapolis, they were opposite types. Kincaid avoided newspaper reporters. He was neither flamboyant nor brilliant. In Halsey's estimation, he had botched the handling of a carrier task force at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands off Guadalcanal in October 1942. After the battle, Halsey had quietly relieved Kincaid, reassigning him to command a squadron of cruisers. Kincaid was bitter about getting shoved aside, especially when Halsey refused to see him afterward. Kincaid had rehabilitated his career by competently handling Army-Navy amphibious operations in Alaska, and when the time came to find a commander to run a fleet reporting to General MacArthur, Kincaid had been given the job. But he had not overcome his resentment of Halsey. MacArthur need not have worried about back channels between old Navy cronies. Kincaid wasn't speaking to Halsey. In hindsight, it is apparent that Admiral Nimitz should have stepped in and made sure that Halsey and Kincaid were properly communicating and that Halsey's intentions were clear. But Nimitz was a successful commander-in-chief in part because he trusted and stood by his subordinates. Nimitz himself had been second-guessed by the profane and bullying Admiral King at the outset of the war. He was not about to repeat the mistake. Nimitz was not unaware of Halsey's freewheeling ways, but he believed in him as a leader. The Navy has a long tradition of letting captains run their own ships and fleet commanders run their own fleets. Command meant solitary responsibility. It had been so in Western navies since the time of Sir Francis Drake. The modern age of communications, the complexity of vast fleet movements over hundreds of miles of ocean, the delicate and intricate dance between landing forces and supporting fleets, all of this cried out for careful coordination. But ego and tradition, mingled with fatigue and the fog of war, got in the way.